Welcome to the Rosenbach Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ames, Associate Curator of the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia. This is Season 2, History Behind the Scenes, in which we explore the Rosenbach's remarkable historical collections, travel behind the scenes into the work of the institution to preserve its holdings, and engage in critical conversations about the place of rare books, libraries, and museums in modern-day American civic life. This episode is part of a mini-series called Voices of American History in the Rosenbach's Collection. Today, I'm joined by Rosenbach Librarian Elizabeth Fuller, Assistant Librarian Nancy Loy, Development Associate Sara Potts, and Sandi Cianciulli, an activist involved in the Carlisle Indian School Project, for a conversation about the complex, tragic, yet very consequential history of what's traditionally been known as the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. We'll discuss the important work being undertaken to highlight marginalized narratives via a new public humanities initiative. With gratitude and humility, the Rosenbach Museum and Library acknowledges that it is situated on Lënapehòkink, the ancestral homelands of the Lenape peoples. A history of broken treaties, forced migrations, and fraudulent agreements, such as the Walking Purchase of 1737, displaced many Indigenous peoples from this land, though some also remain among the continuing historical tribal communities of the region: the Nanticoke Lenni-Lenape Tribal Nation, the Ramapough Lenape Nation, and the Powhatan Renape Nation, the Nanticoke of Millsboro Delaware, and the Lenape of Cheswold Delaware. Learn more at lenape-nation.org. We acknowledge the Lenni-Lenape as the original people of this land and their continuing relationship with their territory. Our museum and library strives to understand our place within a national legacy of colonization, and to act as allies to Indigenous peoples and their vibrant communities today in how we engage with our collections and share the important stories the collections help preserve and communicate. The English poet and Oxford professor James Fenton once made a comment about modernist poet Marianne Moore, whose literary papers, personal and family archive, and other collections reside at the Rosenbach Museum and Library here on idyllic Delancey Place in Philadelphia. Quote, "If we wanted to hold in our minds a single image of the poet Marianne Moore," he says, "it should not be the grand old lady of the New York scene so much as the earnest young woman cycling daily to the federal barracks in Carlisle, Pennsylvania." What could Marianne Moore, who became a key figure in Greenwich Village life in the early and middle decades of the 20th century, and a true icon of New York City in the 1950s and 60s, have to do with military barracks in rural Pennsylvania? Well, it's where her early career took shape. Marianne Moore spent 3 years teaching at a government-run school for Indigenous children named the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. Part of the U.S. federal government's efforts to coerce assimilation of Indigenous peoples into white society, and in the process attempt to stamp out Indigenous cultures, schools like this served the political and economic interests of white power in the United States. Marianne Moore ended up teaching at the school out of her need for a job, and thus she, like many people, ended up a part of a system much larger than herself that, at a civilizational level, caused harm to marginalized people in profound and heartbreaking ways that deeply hurt the very causes of equality, justice, and liberty that the United States is supposed to espouse. However, Moore herself forged respectful and lasting relationships with some of her students, including the famous athlete Jim Thorpe. Her time at the school inspired Moore's lifelong interest in Indigenous cultures and influenced her poetical work for decades to come. A new nonprofit 501c3 public charity called the Carlisle Indian School Project is striving to bring much-needed attention to the history of the school in Carlisle, which still stands today as a U.S. military facility. My esteemed colleagues, Librarian of the Rosenbach Elizabeth E. Fuller, Development Associate Sara Potts, and I are so eager to learn more about the work of the Carlisle Indian School Project because of our exposure to Marianne Moore's early career in teaching, as we encounter it in our Marianne Moore collection at the Rosenbach. So, we decided to take a road trip together to visit some of the leaders of this effort to see firsthand this problematic site that embodies so many of the traumas and paradoxes of U.S. history. Before heading to Carlisle, I wanted to get a better sense of the breadth and scope of the Marianne Moore collection at the Rosenbach to help me place Moore's Carlisle experiences in the scope of the rest of her life and work. So I popped upstairs to the Rosenbach's reading room to meet with Librarian Elizabeth Fuller and Assistant Librarian Nancy Loy for a discussion about Moore's collections here at the Rosenbach. Now I'm in the reading room with our librarian, Elizabeth Fuller, and our assistant librarian, Nancy Loy, to learn a little bit more about Marianne Moore and the Marianne Moore collections here at the Rosenbach before Elizabeth and I take our road trip to Carlisle. We are sitting in the presence of one artifact from our Marianne Moore collection, about which I'm sure Elizabeth and Nancy will tell me more momentarily. Thank you both so much for giving me this primer before our field trip.
Thanks for having us, Alex.
Very glad to do it.
Elizabeth, who was Marianne Moore, and why does the Rosenbach have her collections?
Marianne Moore is an American poet born in 1887 who began writing poems shortly thereafter. She was from the 1920s until her death in the early 1970s, one of the best regarded poets in the United States, both by her literary peers and by the public at large. She began publishing in magazines in the 19-teens, and in addition to writing poems, was the editor of the Dial, one of the most influential literary magazines in the 1920s. So she was not only a poet, but she was editing and critiquing the work of other poets and writers who respected her work enormously. In the her earlier poems were very modernist and experimental in style, very dense. Mm-hmm. Later in her career, she was more interested in reaching a wider, more popular audience and revised her style and some of her earlier poems to be much more accessible. And she became in her last years, really known for popular figure in popular culture. She had always been interested in animals and in athletes and was quite a baseball fan, became known as a baseball fan. She was in popular commercials and so forth. She really was quite a well-known public figure, but equally respected by the most seriously literary poets of the day. As an influential figure in the modernist movement, the leadership of the Rosenbach became interested in her in the late 1960s when she was trying to figure out where to place her papers. The director of the Rosenbach was introduced to her. The Rosenbach had already decided that on the strength of having the manuscript of Joyce's Ulysses, we should become a center for modernist studies. They had already begun augmenting the modernist collections, and on meeting Moore, realized that her correspondence, because it was she herself was not only an influential figure, but her correspondence in her library contained writings of and correspondence with a lot of the other, most of the other influential modernists. So at one stroke, we could acquire all this modernist material. We bought her papers in 1968, and when she died in 1972, she bequeathed us her books and the contents of her apartment, which included a lot of fine and decorative arts, visual images that really influenced her poetry.
Do you think it's surprising at all that she would decide to place her papers here at the Rosenbach as compared to, say, a major university library? I'm curious for your thoughts about sort of how she worked through that issue and the persuasive efforts of the Rosenbach to make it happen.
Yes, she had, as you said, she had a lot of options. She had graduated from Bryn Mawr, and at one point contemplated leaving her papers there. Certainly would have been a very logical place for them. The University of Texas, which was then just building its great humanities research center and had a lot of money to purchase material from everywhere, they courted her. But the Rosenbach director convinced her that she would be a very small fish in a very big pond there. Not that she was a small fish, but Texas was a very big pond. Mm-hmm. And at a small place like the Rosenbach, she could really be a center of attention.
Mm-hmm. Which is true to this day. I mean, she's one of the key figures, not only, as Nancy will tell us more about in the research program that we do, but in terms of public interpretation. I mean, every visitor who steps foot in this place hears about Marianne Moore, sees some of the contents of her living room and the period room we have installed here. So it's proven to be an accurate sort of assessment of the situation.
That's right. I should say that her connection to the rest of the collections is much stronger than simply Ulysses or even modernism. Moore was interested in everything and wrote about everything we have in our collection, things related to. He's interested in everything. Wrote about everything from the early English settlements at Jamestown. We have American historical collections that very deeply describe all of that early period, and the natural history of North America, which natural history was a great interest of hers. She, of course, was aware of the long English language poetic tradition and evoked earlier poets in her writing. We have a number of those people's works. She had a portrait of Robert Burns hanging on in her living room, and we have a great Robert Burns collection. Her mother grew up in Gettysburg and was born shortly before the battle. We have family papers of hers. She kept everything. She had letters from her grandparents' generation describing events of the Civil War in the Gettysburg-Chambersburg area, which dovetail very nicely with other historical collections that we have on the same topic.
Really interesting. I mean, as unique a figure, as singular a figure as she is, the nature of her collection is such that it really does fit into and enhance so many other areas of the Rosenbach's collecting program.
That's right. We have to remind people when we show them the reconstruction of her living room that she never lived here, but her collection is very much at home here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that context. As you know, one of the key themes of this season of the podcast is this behind-the-scenes look at how an organization, a collecting institution, comes to exist in its present-day format. So this is really interesting to learn more about. And Nancy, thank you again for being on the podcast. Much appreciated. I'm wondering if you can tell us more about what the Marianne Moore collection consists of. It's vast in scope and very multidimensional, figuratively and literally. Tell us more about what it contains.
Definitely a highlight that Elizabeth has mentioned is the correspondence. There's so much of it between her, various individuals in her life, other institutions that she was in contact with. And I think a great feature of that is that you can see the back and forth of the correspondence. That's not always the case in archives. One set could go one place and the other set another, but she kept carbon copies of her responses to folks. So you get to see like the full scope of that, including that longevity with like her family correspondence dating back to the 1800s. There's a lot of her personal library is entirely here. Some in the Marianne Moore room, which recreates her living room in Greenwich Village, and others in book storage as well. The fine and decorative arts are extensive. If you want to see her iconic tricorn hat, we have that as well. And I think the vertical files are kind of interesting too, because she kept so much material that helped inspire her work and her writing, divided neatly into various topics that caught her attention and that she kept.
I've been here for 4 years now on the staff of the Rosenbach, and I don't think I've ever encountered or engaged with the vertical files. So that might have to be my next, the new frontier, so to speak. It's really interesting.
Kind of aware of it because, researchers are the ones who, bring certain context and meaning to what we have. So we've rummaged around in some of those for folks who have come to visit us. We shouldn't forget the scrapbooks and the date books. There's that large project that the University of Buffalo is doing with the Marianne Moore Digital Archive to digitize her notebooks and make them available with annotations from scholars.
Did we mention the literary papers themselves?
Yes, of course. There's also her typescripts from her poems, her translation work as well. So I think it's a unique opportunity to be able to see, all aspects of the creative process.
And to situate that creative process in everyday lived experience with all of these artifacts that we have in the collection. It's really, really fascinating to have all of this material together, as you say. So tell us more about who comes to research and make use of the Moore collection. What kind of researchers are, stepping into the reading room to engage with all of this material?
Definitely, it's a draw for academics, faculty, graduate students, but there are also folks from the creative professions, writers and performers who are seeking inspiration. Undergraduate students come, and just folks who have a personal interest, and we're happy to welcome all of them to explore the collections.
Elizabeth, tell us a little bit about this book that we have sitting in front of us.
Well, this is the first published book of Moore's work. It's a collection of poems that she had published in various magazines throughout the 19-teens and early 20s. This is the first published book of Moore's poems, titled Poems, which appeared in 1921. She had been publishing poems since her days at Bryn Mawr in the 1900s, and had then published in Poetry, one of the most influential American literary magazines, in The Egoist, a number of places. And a lot of her poetic peers had been asking her to publish a collection and offering to make that happen. Moore was quite a perfectionist and was just not ready yet to bring it out. But finally, by 1921, her good friend and poet H.D. Hilda Doolittle and her partner Briar couldn't wait any longer. And without her knowledge, they gathered a number of poems and had them published by Harriet Shaw Weaver at the Egoist Press. Moore didn't know anything about it until the copy arrived in the mail one day.
Oh, gosh, that must have been an unpleasant surprise.
It was quite a surprise. She wasn't going to blame people for it. She said she knew it was done out of love. But she did tell Briar in a letter that afternoon. Of course, Moore is always talking about natural history. So she said, Darwin, she also has to cite the work. In Variations of Plants and Animals Under Domestication, Darwin speaks of a variety of pigeon that is born naked and without any down whatever. I feel like that Darwinian gosling.
Wow.
We have several copies of the book, and this, like many copies of her books, anytime Moore was an absolute perfectionist, she revised her poems after they had been published the first time. And whenever she got her hands on a copy of one of her books, she would make corrections in it. So she has added here a complete list. The page that says several of these poems appeared in other publications. So she has added a complete list here. She has corrected some titles. And for instance, one that here is called Rainbow. It is The Rainbow. One that here is titled Talisman. No, it's A Talisman. It's not The Rainbow. It is This is one of these long titles, which also serves as the first line of a poem. This is called, "You are like the realistic product of an idealistic search for gold at the foot of the rainbow."
Doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, but it certainly is a more titillating title.
Yes.
Interesting.
And there are other little changes throughout.
And this is just one artifact of thousands from the Marianne Moore collection, and hopefully gives listeners a sense of just how rich and diverse our holdings are in this area.
Yes, Moore finally did bring out her, even the Spurt, finally bring out her own first chosen collection in 1924. It was called Observations, which is a perfect title because she was always a keen observer of everything.
Wonderful. The naked gosling no more. Wonderful. Thanks for sharing that object with us. Well, thank you so much, Nancy and Elizabeth, for this primer in Marianne Moore and her collections here at the Rosenbach, which has equipped me, and I hope our listeners, for our upcoming road trip to Carlisle to learn more about Marianne Moore's early formative days and how her history connects to the complex and very important history of Indigenous peoples in Pennsylvania. So thanks again for your time.
Thanks, Alex. Enjoy your trip.
The perspective I got from Nancy and Elizabeth about the Moore collection really opened my eyes and got me thinking about how a deeper understanding of the cultural context of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, when Moore lived and worked there, would help deepen our understanding of Moore's life and work. One Saturday afternoon, Elizabeth, Sara, and I took a road trip to Carlisle to visit the Carlisle Military Barracks and learn more about the Carlisle Indian School Project. Following a really fascinating tour of the site with Sandi Cianciulli, we sat down for a conversation about the organization's work. We met at the Whistle Stop Bookshop, appropriately enough, which is owned by Jeff Wood. It seems like a very appropriate place for our conversation, given the Rosenbach brothers' book-selling past. So, Sandi, I want to thank you so much, both for the really fascinating, emotional, powerful, impactful tour that you led for us this morning, and also for the opportunity to sit down now after that experience to talk more about your personal experiences with this project.
It was my pleasure. And thank you for this interview.
Sandi, I want to thank you also for the very moving tour. Can you tell us what was the Carlisle Indian School and what is the Carlisle Indian School Project?
Well, the Carlisle Indian School, Indian Industrial School, was founded in 1879, and it was the project of William H. Pratt, who had the idea at the time in 1879, 3 years after the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The political atmosphere was such that there was a political movement to exterminate Indian people. And Pratt came up with the idea to assimilate rather than exterminate, although his language was kill the Indian to save the man. He had been the prison guard down in Marianne, Fort Marianne, with Apaches, and he learned a great deal about the tribal people there. And he saw how they learned. It was actually through his giving them ledger paper to draw on that ledger art became an art form of the tribes. So he wanted to build a school around that model. And there had been boarding schools that the government paid faith-based organizations to run for many years before. But they were usually located close by to where the tribes were. He had an idea to take them far away from their home. So it was the first off-reservation, government-run boarding school. And it was the Carlisle barracks were abandoned after the Confederates bombed it. So it was sitting there empty. And he talked to the Department of War about using it as a school. And it was a perfect location because it was far enough away from the tribes that were causing the trouble. So the first class was made up of students from the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes, the allies that had participated in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The Army requested that Pratt choose children of some of the leaders, the tribal leaders, so that they could force them to the treaty table. In October 6th of 1879, 182 students came from the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho and arrived at the school at midnight. They pulled into the station at Carlisle, surrounded by the townspeople who knew they were coming and wanted to get a look at the savages, or the wild Indians. Most of the children were between the ages of 5 to 18. They didn't even have beds for them yet, but this was the first class. And I had a relative who was in that first class.
Now, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you got involved in the Carlisle Indian School Project?
Well, when I was about 6 years old, my father brought me to the Carlisle barracks, just to the cemetery, because we used to go to little road trips. I think my mother needed a break, but I loved my road trips with my father. And he told me that we had relatives that went to the school, and we needed to stop and pay our respects. So having grown up in Philadelphia at that point, there was always a line to go somewhere, and you had to pay to get into something. I wasn't used to just pulling off on the side of the road, and nobody else was stopping. So it was nice to have my father all to myself, and that's what he told me. He didn't know their names, and he didn't know when they were there. So it wasn't until I was in my 60s that I found out what their names were and when they were there, and the significance of that. So I had been involved in the political aspect of Native America. As a mixed blood, that's where I fit in better, I felt, for me. And I am a lifetime member of the National Congress of American Indians, and I spent my life, advocating for positive policy on the reservation, so that the people don't realize that the decisions that Washington makes impacts the everyday life of reservation people, because they have that federal relationship. So that was something I focused my life on. And then when I retired and kept learning a little bit more about Carlisle. I was born and raised in Philadelphia, so it was in my own state, and I wanted to know more about it. And then Dickinson College got the grant to do all the research, and the more I learned, the more I just became passionate about it.
So tell us a little bit more about what the Carlisle Indian School Project is, the work that it's currently engaged in, and can you tell me more about who's running the project, how Indigenous people and communities are involved in the work, and how this project takes into account the wants, the needs, the political and cultural concerns of Indigenous communities in the United States today?
Well, we started about 10 years ago, and it was originally a project under the Circle Legacy Center, which is the Indian Center in Pennsylvania. It's we meet in Lancaster. And we have a board of directors, and we have some non-Indian people that are on the board, but mostly it's a Native board. And we started coming to Carlisle and decided we wanted to do something. We didn't know what. There was an old farmhouse that they were talking about tearing down, and we thought that might be a good idea, but then we had someone look at it who was an engineer, and he said, well, you're going to have the first $3 million you raise, you're going to have to spend it just to bring it up to code. So we thought, well, talk to other people in the town, because we got to know people in the town. And they said, well, there's plenty of land around, and why don't you consider an off-reservation? And when the Circle Legacy Board talked about it, we said, well, maybe that would be a better idea, because then it would be something separate. But we would still have access to the original campus where we could lead tours and so forth. So that's how it started. And then it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and it outgrew Circle Legacy. So we decided to form our own board, and we have a national board. Everyone is Native. Everyone is a descendant, if not of Carlisle, of some boarding school. Because most Indians are descended from a boarding school, and the experiences are the same. And so we decided to do that. We formed our board. Like I said, it's all Native. We have an advisory board, and we work with tribes from various regions, and we meet with them all the time. It's a very good time for this. Now, 10 years ago when we started, there wasn't a whole lot of conversation about it. But now, since the residential schools in Canada, the things that are going on there, and the fact that we have a Native person as the Secretary of the Interior, Secretary Deb Haaland, we're getting a lot more attention. And things are moving very well and very fast. And we still have a lot to do. And of course, we were interrupted by COVID. But we're very happy with our progress. And we're getting more and more involved all the time. The positive reaction that we've got from Indian country. In the beginning, when we started out, some of the people said, well, why didn't they just burn that place down? But we had an elder at a tourism conference who stood up and said, this Carlisle thing, you need to pay attention, because if you don't, they'll say it never happened. And that seemed to inspire. I wish I could remember his name so I could take him with me wherever I go. But it's that's where we are now, and it's a good place, and we're very pleased. I've been in it for the head of it for 10 years now, and I'm ready to step aside, and I'm still going to maintain our relationships, particularly in Carlisle, because you want the place where you're going to have a business. You want that to be, an interpretive center about the boarding schools. Just, it's just a lot of things said about Carlisle. It's the most famous school. It should have its interpretive center to be more than just about Carlisle, but the whole policy, the whole process, and the impact that it had. And there are organizations, other organizations, that we're working hand in glove with also.
Sounds like pretty early in the conversations about this work, still when it was still contained within the Circle Legacy Society, you rather quickly realized that the story was not being told, in a wholesome, sort of full fashion, and that there needed to be a physical site in the town where it was told. Was that sort of a natural conclusion that you needed a building in the area?
And we needed a building with the Carlisle address. We needed a building in the place where it was all supposed to end.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, we talked to the Native American Hall of Fame people to see if we could have a permanent display so that we could come full circle to show that not only are we here, we're thriving, we're excelling, and we make valuable contributions to this contemporary society. We're not historical items that belong in a dusty old museum. And we don't want the Interpretive Center to be a dusty old museum. We want it to be something that lifts up all the great successes and so that Indians are not portrayed so much as something from the past, as much as and always a victim or the enemy, but that they were always an important part of society that had been overlooked and forced to change and fit in where they didn't fit. So anyway, that's the I got all my statements in there how I feel, what it should be.
And very eloquently stated too.
Thank you.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Very strong.
The historic site of the school today functions as an installation management agency supporting the U.S. Army War College. What is it like to be engaging in your public humanities work in this context? And have you found allies and supporters in the Army?
It's very interesting. There's always, with the Indians and so forth, the history, they've kind of been locking horns, particularly on the football field. But the reception that we got was, I thought, inspiring. We found out about a tradition that they've had for nearly 50 years now, Jim Thorpe Sports Days. The only thing is, a lot of people didn't realize that Jim Thorpe was an Indian person. He was an Olympic legend. So the Jim Thorpe Sports Days are the trainers of the various war colleges that get together, average age 40, so we're not too serious, It's a lot of fun. It was team building exercise. And they made it like the Olympics. They ran the relay races and they had the torch. Whoever won the relay race got to light the torch. And it was, Jim Thorpe, Olympic legend. Well, did you know Jim Thorpe was an Indian? He was. So I got talking to Carol Kerr, who at the time was the PR person. And she's the one that took me there. And I said, our veterans would love this. Because as much as that we may be kind of conflicted with the Army, Indians are like natural military people. They're warriors, and they make up a big portion of the military. They would just love this. And it would be nice for the people of Carlisle to know that Jim Thorpe was a Native person, which is why you have a Native person come and start the games. And her response was, and we have a Jim Thorpe bedroom. And I said, and that's how we get the veterans to come. And we've been doing it now. Next year will be our 9th year. We were told at first, we'll try it for 5 years. So we're going on our 9th year, and it's been a great experience. The last, the one we had in 2019, Secretary Holland, who was then Representative Holland, was our special guest. And it was amazing. And it is a collaborative effort that we work with the Army. It's been very healing for us. And we're made to feel a part of it. They introduce us. They have made an effort to learn a little bit more about Jim Thorpe. And they have someone come and tell a little little story about Jim Thorpe's life, something in his biography that they didn't realize. And we're very impressed with how they made it and they worked with us on that. So we're happy with that relationship. We are in the process now of talking to them about changing some names of streets and buildings so that there's a little more recognition on the original campus that it was an Indian industrial boarding school for 40 years.
It sounds like the Jim Thorpe story, which is, exciting, inspirational, relates to a famous figure, is maybe a useful inroad with your relationship with the Army to open up this broader conversation about the history of the school and all of the students who attended, even those who did not become famous athletes.
And there was so much more than the sports. There was the band. There was Angel Decora, who was a famous illustrator, and things changed drastically after the turn of the century. And I believe it was another superintendent came after Pratt retired. So maybe that made a difference. And I'm not a historian, but I'm just absorbing as much information as I can because it's just fascinating. And I want to learn more about what the experience was. A great uncle that was in the first class isn't anybody. I just learned his name, So it's not that I feel like I'm a boarding school survivor or anything. I didn't go to boarding school. And my grandfather was I guess you would call him a horse whisperer. And my father didn't go to a boarding school because he needed him to help him break horses. So I don't really I've heard from other relatives that went there. This is all, I can't get enough of it, so it's, and I love to talk about it.
So, on the one hand, engaging with this history must be profoundly emotional and, painful in many ways, because not only does it relate to your community, but as you've described for us, it connects to your family in multiple ways. And yet you say it's also, you can't get enough of it. It's perhaps in some way empowering. Can you say more about what these 10 years have been like in terms of shaping sort of your sense of cultural identity through this really painful part of American history?
Well, my other ancestry is German. Very German. And so history on either side wasn't anything I was very interested in as a child. This is going back years. It was always bad news. So when I had a relative come and live with us for a while, and she bought me regalia because she thought I should be dancing, I guess. I was a teenager, so, I didn't appreciate it. And I didn't want to do it, but I did it for her because she was kind of prickly. You have a mentor. People say, oh, so wonderful you had a mentor to nurture you. She wasn't that kind of a mentor. She liked fear. And it worked on me. And I danced until somebody gave me a ribbon and I could give it to her. And then I told her I didn't want to dance. And she said, well, you have to just, give your regalia to somebody that'll use it. And I thought, oh, good. I don't have to do anything. And then as I'm walking away, she said, but don't think you don't have to do anything because being Indian's a verb. So she took me to the National Congress of American Indians, and I just loved it. And that's how I got involved with the policy. And that was the cultural thing for me.
Mm-hmm.
That was something I understood that kind of balanced things out, that I wasn't so much involved in the history. I was being part of the solution to the future. But as you get older and you start to reflect, and I was retired, and things were changing. Thanks to the Indian Education Act, we have all kinds of Ivy League lawyers now in Indian country. So, I kind of outlived my purpose there. And then to find the names of, okay, they have a name now. Well, I don't have my father, I can't tell him.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm glad he told me when I was 6 years old that we had relatives. And it kind of fell in my lap. And so that's how I got involved in that. And then the universe just kind of takes over. Dickinson College got the grant to do this wonderful resource website, the Carlisle Indian School Digital Resource Center, and it's just an amazing resource. And I got to learn, and I now have pictures. We didn't have any family pictures, so I'm very happy to have those pictures now.
If you could go back in time and tell your ancestors who were students at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School something about the future that maybe would make their time there a little bit easier, what would you want those children to know?
That I'm going to do everything in my power so that nobody ever forgets. And the world is going to know that they were there.
I think we've covered the first part of the question very well about your question, about your hopes for the future of the project. So, this has been wonderful, Sandi. How can listeners find out more about your project?
Well, we've been told we have a wonderful website, and it's Carlisle Indian School. If you just Google Carlisle Indian School Project, I think it's the first thing that comes up. And we tell the backstory, and we've got some designs there, and on what we want it to look like. And there's a donate button on every page. Everybody knows these things take money. And we're working with tribal leaders now who think that we should get a resolution passed through Congress. No, we didn't ask to go there. So with all the attention that's been given to the boarding school and the recognition, we think that, so that's what we're going to do.
Well, thank you so much again, Sandi, for not only giving us a tour and sharing more information with us about this important historical issue, but for sharing your own story with us today and welcoming us into your experiences with this work. It's really been, as I mentioned at the top of the program, both emotionally powerful and really enlightening to learn more about your experiences, to be able to connect our Marianne Moore collection more closely with the place where Moore worked for a few years. And I think I speak for all of us when I say, to have the opportunity to reflect on how the history of this country continues to shape the present day experiences of all of us, and will doubtless shape many generations into the future as well. And the work that you are doing will change the world for the better too. So thank you again so much for being willing to host us, and I do hope that we can welcome you to the Rosenbach sometime soon.
I would love to come. We're all in this together, and the more we learn, the more we see. We have so much more in common than differences.
Thank you for listening to the Rosenbach Podcast. Check back soon for another glimpse into the Rosenbach Museum and Library's remarkable collection of rare books, manuscripts, art, and artifacts, and for more fascinating conversations about history, art, and culture. To learn more about the Rosenbach, visit rosenbach.org. We host a variety of on-site and online events and public programs, and always welcome questions from listeners about how to use our collections. Our holdings are always accessible to researchers who make a free appointment to visit our reading room. Would you like to learn more about the Marianne Moore collection? Get started by checking out our Marianne Moore collection guides on our website at rosenbach.org/research. If you're interested in learning more about Marianne Moore's early life in Carlisle, I recommend you read Rosenbach researcher Linda Level's landmark biography, Holding On Upside Down, The Life and Work of Marianne Moore, the early chapters of which will be of tremendous interest. You'll also want to listen to an upcoming episode of the Rosenbach podcast titled Idiosyncrasy and Technique, a conversation with Linda Level about the gender, sexuality, and celebrity of Marianne Moore, one of America's best-loved poets, which will debut just a few weeks after today's episode launches. I also highly recommend that you check out an article written by Rosenbach researchers Leslie Wheeler and Chris Gavaller titled Imposters and Chameleons, Marianne Moore and the Carlisle Indian School, published in Paiduma, Modern and Contemporary Poetry and Poetics in 2004. We'll link to it from our website. To learn about the Carlisle Indian School Project, visit their website at carlisleindianschoolproject.com. The land acknowledgement at the top of this episode was inspired by the Philadelphia Museum of Art's acknowledgement, which you can read at philamuseum.org/about/DEIA. The Rosenbach's community reaches all around the globe, brought together by our love for history, rare books, manuscripts, and the arts. I hope you will consider supporting the Rosenbach Museum and Library and this podcast by becoming a member today. It's one of the best ways to help us with projects like this. Memberships start at just $55 and give you access to everything we have to offer, online and in person. If you cannot make a financial contribution, please give our podcast a good rating on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to help us build our audience. The theme music for Season 2 of the podcast is a setting of the poem Longings, written by poet, artist, and educator Nellie Rathbone Bright in 1927. Bright co-founded the Black Opals, a collective and literary journal showcasing young black writers in Philadelphia in the late 1920s. The musical version featured here was performed by Yolanda Wisher, Paul Geis, V. Shane Frederick, Mark Anthony Palacio, and Sir Lance Gamble. The Rosenbach podcast is supported by a grant from the Evelyn Toll Family Foundation. Thanks again, and I look forward to continuing our conversation about history on the next episode of the Rosenbach podcast.
In the heart of me, drums in my ears, and my lips are wet with the tang of the sea.